Stephen stood in a room full of regional vice presidents, swirling a $12 glass of Merlot, and told of ambition who would die in a cubicle. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I simply memorized the exact pitch of his smug laughter, went home, and prepared to detonate the $15 million secret I had been keeping from him for 7 years. 14 days later, his carefully curated world collapsed into absolute ruin, and he never even saw the match being struck. I am an accountant. That is the label my husband, Stephen, used to package me into a neat, unthreatening little box. To Stephen, my job was a punchline. It was a tedious, unglamorous profession that perfectly contrasted with his dynamic, high-flying life as a regional director of sales. He was 44, aggressively handsome, and consumed by his own impending greatness. I was 41, quiet, observant, and deeply comfortable with spreadsheets. At least, that was the character I played in our marriage. Stephen grew up as the undisputed golden child of a mother who treated his every breath like a miracle. He carried that expectation of worship into adulthood, and for a long time, I provided it. Or rather, I provided the stable, silent background against which he could shine. Narcissists don't just want an audience. They want an audience that knows its place. My place, according to Stephen, was in the audience, holding his coat, marveling at his brilliance, and quietly paying the mortgage when his commission checks fell short. He engaged in a subtle, daily form of gaslighting, constantly rewriting history so that my financial contributions were minimized and his potential was maximized. If I paid his credit card, he was investing in his network. If I stayed home on a Friday night, it was because I lacked the social stamina required for his elite corporate world. What Stephen didn't know, what no one in his insular, ego-driven circle knew, was that accounting was merely the daytime camouflage for my actual career. The numbers were just how I rested my mind. My true work happened at night, when Stephen was asleep or out aggressively entertaining clients. I was a ghost trader, and not just someone who polished corporate memoirs or self-published romance novels. I was the sole architect behind 3 consecutive New York Times bestsellers, complex thrillers that dominated summer reading lists. The name on the cover of those gripping novels belonged to a photogenic former actress who did morning show interviews. But the words were entirely mine. The intricate plotting, the devastating twists, they all came from the mind of the boring accountant. And more importantly, the underlying intellectual property contracts tucked away in a biometric safe inside my office were strictly in my name. I had negotiated a brutal, brilliant contract early on. I held the underlying copyright. I held the lion's share of the royalty rights. I was the invisible ghost who owned the entire haunting. But Stephen didn't know that. Stephen thought I spent my evenings balancing ledgers for mid-sized logistics firms. The breaking point didn't happen in our living room. It didn't happen during a screaming match. It happened on a Thursday evening at a downtown networking mixer. I had come straight from my accounting firm, wearing a sensible navy blazer, bringing the spare keys he demanded I deliver after locking his in the trunk. I walked into the softly lit banquet hall, navigating the crowd of suited executives. I spotted him near the open bar, holding court with 3 senior partners from a rival firm. I stepped up behind him, just out of his peripheral vision, waiting politely for a break in the conversation to hand him the keys. That is when I heard it. One of the partners, a man with silver hair, asked Stephen if I would be joining them for the upcoming corporate retreat in Cabo. Stephen let out a short, humorless laugh. Claire? No. Cabo is for closers. Claire has absolutely no ambition. She's just going to be an accountant forever. She doesn't have the creative drive to understand what we do. I love her, but she's perfectly content being entirely unremarkable. My blood ran cold. The sheer casualness of his cruelty was breathtaking. He wasn't even angry. He was just performing. He was using my supposed mediocrity as a convenient footstool to elevate his own status in front of strangers. I stood there, perfectly still, as the men chuckled at my expense. I didn't step forward. I didn't drop the keys. I placed them quietly on the edge of the mahogany bar directly behind him, turned around, and walked out into the cool October night. For years, I had convinced myself that keeping my literary success a secret was an act of marital humility. I thought I was protecting his fragile ego, shielding our marriage from the resentment that would inevitably arise if he knew his unremarkable wife was out turning him tenfold. But sitting alone in my car, staring blankly at the leather steering wheel, I realized the terrifying, isolating truth about keeping the peace. Keeping the peace in a toxic, narcissistic dynamic is nothing more than a polite, acceptable name for slow self-destruction. When you continually shrink yourself to fit into someone else's diminutive narrative, you aren't being kind or supportive. You are actively handing them the chisel they will use to chip away your basic human dignity. I had enabled his delusion that my worth was defined entirely by my invisibility, and he had repaid that years-long loyalty by casually serving me up as a pathetic joke to men who didn't even know my last name. I started the engine, pulling out of the concrete parking garage with a strange, icy clarity settling deep into my chest. I didn't know it then, but as I drove home that night, the obedient, unremarkable accountant he thought he married was already dead, and what was coming to replace her was going to cost him absolutely everything. What I've told you so far is how he built the illusion of my insignificance. What comes next is how I systematically dismantled it, piece by piece, document by document. When Stephen finally arrived home that Thursday night, it was past 1 in the morning. I was sitting at the kitchen island, staring at the cold blue light of my laptop screen. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't thank me for bringing his keys. He simply tossed his leather briefcase onto the granite counter, loudly complaining about how painfully slow the valet had been. He hadn't seen me. He had no idea I had stood 3 feet behind him and listened to him reduce my existence to a cheap punchline. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and felt absolutely nothing. The anger was entirely gone. The hurt was gone. What replaced it was a profound, clinical detachment. I didn't cry. I took action. The next morning, the temperature in my soul dropped to absolute 0. My sentences became shorter. My actions became surgical. I didn't say a single word about the networking mixer. I silently poured his coffee. I handed him his dry cleaning. I watched him drive away in his leased luxury car. Then I picked up the phone and called my intellectual property attorney, Marcus. I told Marcus it was time to initiate the disclosure protocol. For 7 years, the massive royalty checks from my thrillers had been routed into an offshore trust, completely legally, completely separate from our marital accounts. Stephen didn't know it existed. But when you are dealing with a narcissist, secrecy isn't enough. You need armor. People often think that financial abuse only happens when someone actively controls your bank account or limits your daily spending habits. But financial abuse is also hiding your own worth out of fear of how a fragile partner will react. Building a paper trail before you actually need it is the highest form of self-care. A document signed before the conflict begins is basic self-preservation, because once the ego is wounded, a narcissist will try to claim everything you built as their own. I had Marcus draw up a rigorous post-nuptial asset review, meticulously separating the intellectual property I generated before and during the marriage, legally walling off my entire recreative empire from Stephen's reach. Every document was ironclad. Every signature was properly notarized. My financial fortress was completely impenetrable. I didn't know it then, but the timing of that specific phone call was the crucial domino that would ultimately crush his ego into dust. With my assets secured, I moved to the next phase. My literary agent had been forwarding me urgent requests for several months. A highly influential, globally recognized podcast, a show dedicated to the mechanics of writing and the industry's hidden giants, had been begging for an interview with the brilliant mind behind the best-selling thrillers. Usually, the actress whose face graced the back cover did these press tours, repeating the carefully crafted talking points I had written for her. But Clause 7 of our master contract was very clear. I retained the absolute right to unmask myself, to claim full public credit as the sole author, at a time and place of my choosing. I emailed the podcast producer directly. I told them the ghost was ready to speak. They replied within exactly 4 minutes. They were absolutely ecstatic. We scheduled a live, unedited video interview for the following Wednesday. It would be broadcast to over 3 million active subscribers. The days leading up to the scheduled interview were a masterclass in psychological control. I moved through our house like a phantom. I watched Stephen strut around, bragging about his mundane sales quotas, utterly oblivious to the massive hurricane gathering just off his coast. Over dinner, he would patronize me. He would explain basic financial concepts to me, an accountant, while chewing his steak. "You should really look into mutual funds, Claire," he said on Monday night, pointing his silver fork directly at me. "I know your little accounting firm avoids dealing with major wealth management, but you need to start thinking bigger. You are never going to get anywhere just crunching numbers for small businesses." I kept my voice steady. "You are right, Stephen. I should probably start thinking bigger." I let out a short, humorless laugh. He smiled, proudly assuming I was agreeing with his infinite wisdom. The sheer audacity of his condescension was staggering. He had no idea the woman sitting across from him was currently finalizing a huge $1 million advance for her 4th novel. He had no idea that while he was trying to sell software to middle managers, I was negotiating global film rights. I completely stopped doing his laundry. I completely stopped making his coffee. When he asked why, I simply told him I was swamped with some extra bookkeeping. He rolled his eyes and muttered something about my pathetic lack of time management. Every insult, every subtle aggression, just fueled the cold engine running inside me. I was gathering data. I was confirming my hypothesis. He did not love me. He loved the void I filled. He loved having a reliable shadow. On Tuesday afternoon, Marcus couriered the final physical copies of my new book contract. It was a staggering 4-book deal with a major publishing house, entirely under my real name. No more ghostwriting. No more smiling actress on the cover. Just me. The contract was massive, bound in thick blue paper, representing a level of generational wealth Stephen could not achieve in 10 lifetimes. I locked it inside my biometric safe. Wednesday morning finally arrived. The day of the podcast. Stephen kissed my cheek absent-mindedly, told me not to forget to pick up his dry cleaning, and walked out the door. The producer counted down in my headphones. This was the spark. The internet was about to catch fire, and Stephen was totally covered in invisible gasoline. That was the setup. Now here's where I stopped being patient and started being precise. The podcast interview aired at exactly 9 in the morning on Wednesday. I sat alone in my home office, staring directly into the glowing webcam, and methodically stripped away 7 years of calculated invisibility. For 2 hours, I explained the intricate process of ghostwriting complex narratives. I detailed how I built the psychological profiles for my villains, drawing heavily from the narcissism I observed daily. And then, with over 3 million people watching the livestream, I held up the original, handwritten manuscript of the very first bestseller. I showed the camera the early drafts, the marginalia, unequivocally proving I was the sole creator. The internet did not just react, it detonated. By Thursday afternoon, my real name was trending globally across all platforms. Literary critics, rabid fans, and massive news outlets were aggressively scrambling to cover the unmasking of the decade's most successful thriller author. My phone battery literally died twice from the sheer volume of incoming calls from top-tier publishers and international agents. Stephen, however, remained entirely in the dark. He had been away on a rigorous 2-day regional sales blitz, completely disconnected from social media algorithms, obsessing over his pathetic quarterly metrics in budget hotel room. MS. He was scheduled to return home on Friday evening. I decided to make his homecoming incredibly memorable. At exactly 6 o'clock on Friday, I was sitting at the massive kitchen island, meticulously signing my name across the final pages of the new, extremely lucrative 4-book publishing contract. The heavy front door unlocked. Stephen did not come home alone. To my absolute strategic advantage, he had brought home Greg and Thomas, 2 of the senior vice presidents from his firm, the exact same men from the downtown networking mixer. He loudly announced he wanted to show off his new imported espresso machine. The trap was finally set, and all I had to do was wait for him to step right inside. This is the moment I had vividly envisioned 1,000 times. But reality always carries friction. My encrypted email client unexpectedly crashed, preventing my attorney's final confirmation message from loading. My chest tightened sharply, and for a fleeting second, a wave of genuine, nauseating anxiety washed over me. It wasn't movie perfect. I thought I was entirely ready for that moment, but my hands were slightly shaking. Stephen strutted into the kitchen, his silk tie loosened, projecting the exhausted arrogance of a conquering hero. "Claire, be a dear and clear up this boring paperwork. We are making drinks," he commanded, fully expecting my usual, pathetic, and immediate silent obedience. I did not move a single muscle. I placed my pen down. I kept my voice steady. "I think you need to check your phone, Stephen, because your colleagues already are." Greg and Thomas had pulled out their phones, their screens illuminated by identical viral news alerts. The headline was inescapable. "Quiet accountant revealed as mastermind behind $50 million thriller empire." I slowly pushed the thick, blue-bound publishing contract across the polished granite island directly toward him, exposing the massive numbers. Stephen snatched his phone. He read the alert twice. His eyes slowly drifted down to the contract, focusing on the staggering seven-figure advance printed clearly on the summary page. His face drained of color. He tried to laugh, a desperate, choking sound, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stared at the signature line, his hands trembling so violently that he dropped his phone onto the hardwood floor. The arrogant regional director vanished. Greg looked from his phone to me, his jaw unhinged. The room went dead silent. "Cabo is for closers, Stephen," I said, my tone absolute ice. Watching him completely collapse in front of the very men he used to casually humiliate me was not just vindicating, it was profoundly educational. When you finally stop accepting less than you deserve, the people who benefited from your silence will inevitably accuse you of betrayal. But boundaries are simply a clear description of what you will and will not accept in your own life. Enforcing those boundaries is never cruelty, it is clarity. Narcissistic systems use your natural empathy as a weapon, convincing you that their emotional comfort is your permanent responsibility. They demand endless, unquestioning loyalty, but offer absolutely nothing in return. You simply cannot reason with someone who actively benefits from misunderstanding you. Leaving quietly, legally, and permanently is the most powerful thing you can do. By exposing the undeniable truth, I had completely severed his primary supply of control, leaving him suffocating in reality. The silence in the kitchen stretched out for what felt like an eternity. It was suffocating and heavy, as the monumental weight of the situation finally crushed the last remaining fragments of his meticulously crafted ego. He slowly looked up from the shattered phone on the floor. His eyes were incredibly wide, filled with a pathetic mixture of raw panic and profound, undeniable disorientation. The golden child was dead. The men he so desperately wanted to impress were now staring at him with undisguised pity and disgust. Thomas quietly placed his unpoured glass back onto the counter and took a step back toward the hallway, physically distancing himself from the wreckage. I calmly gathered my important documents and slowly slipped them back into my structured leather briefcase, snapping the heavy brass lock shut with a sharp, decisive click. The hollow sound echoed loudly. What I'm about to tell you is the exact part I almost completely left out of this story. But you absolutely need to hear it. Stephen took a sudden, wildly aggressive step forward, his knuckles turning totally white as his fists clenched tightly at his sides. The initial paralyzing shock violently mutated into pure, unfiltered, raw rage. He opened his mouth, drawing in a sharp breath, preparing to launch his final desperately cruel verbal attack. He remained completely unaware that I had already fully anticipated this specific explosive reaction. They didn't collapse quietly. They collapsed loudly, messily, and in a way that exposed exactly who they had always been. Walking out of that kitchen on Friday night was only the beginning of the actual war. Stephen didn't immediately pack his bags or apologize for years of relentless belittlement. Instead, a cornered narcissist, suddenly stripped of their false narrative control, immediately becomes the most dangerous and unpredictable version of themselves. He spent the entire weekend desperately trying to aggressively reframe reality, alternating wildly between pathetic sobbing on the living room floor and terrifying, cold bursts of screaming rage. By Monday morning, however, his panic had fully morphed into unearned entitlement. He convinced himself that because we were legally married, he was entitled to 50% of everything I had ever written. He aggressively hired the most expensive, notoriously ruthless divorce attorney in the city, stupidly putting the $50,000 retainer directly onto his already heavily leveraged platinum credit card. The hubris was Shakespearean. His lawyer subpoenaed my financial records, fully expecting to easily find hidden marital assets or a fundamentally weak copyright claim. Instead, my brilliant attorney, Marcus, happily provided them with a flawless, bulletproof postnuptial agreement. It was the exact same document Stephen had blindly and arrogantly signed 5 years earlier when he briefly started a failing consulting business and desperately wanted to protect what he assumed would be his massive fortune from my supposedly mediocre accounting income. He had legally and permanently walled himself off from my entire publishing empire completely by his own arrogant hand. The brutal financial reality hit him like a runaway freight train. Because the royalty trust was entirely protected and our marital house was still heavily mortgaged, there was absolutely no massive, life-saving payout coming his way. I forced the immediate sale of the property. Stephen couldn't even come close to qualifying to buy me out. Within 45 days, the sprawling, luxurious suburban house he used to constantly brag about to his colleagues was completely emptied and sold to a nice retired couple from Ohio. He was forced to move into a remarkably depressing, cramped 2-bedroom apartment complex located right next to a constantly busy, incredibly loud commercial highway. His professional life completely imploded with the exact same spectacular speed. Greg and Thomas, the senior vice presidents who witnessed his absolute, devastating humiliation in our kitchen, simply didn't keep the secret. Corporate sales environments thrive exclusively on vicious gossip, and Stephen's carefully cultivated image as the brilliant, dominant alpha male was permanently, irreparably shattered. He was no longer the intimidating closer. He was the office punchline. His sales numbers plummeted dramatically. Exactly 3 months after the podcast aired, he was quietly and unceremoniously let go from his prestigious regional director position. As I watched his life systematically unravel from the comfortable, quiet distance of my new downtown penthouse, I realized something profoundly important about the emotional prison I had lived in for a decade. For years, I had carried this heavy, suffocating burden, secretly believing that I was somehow actively hurting him by being quietly successful. But you absolutely have to understand the critical, fundamental distinction between guilt and shame, especially when you are surviving a deeply narcissistic relationship. Guilt is the uncomfortable feeling that you did something specifically wrong. It is tied to a tangible action. Shame, however, is the insidious, toxic, and paralyzing belief that you simply are wrong. That your very existence, your natural talents, your quiet ambitions are somehow inherently flawed, offensive, or damaging to the people around you. Stephen didn't make me feel guilty. He systematically engineered a deep, pervasive sense of shame within my core. He desperately needed me to feel ashamed of my own limitless potential so that I would voluntarily shrink down to a manageable size, a size that made his fragile ego feel massive. Narcissistic family systems and relationships rely entirely on this specific psychological distortion to survive. They weaponize your natural empathy, making you genuinely believe that outshining them is an unforgivable act of violence against them. It isn't. Refusing to apologize for your own brilliance is the absolute baseline of self-respect. The final time I ever saw Stephen was at the mandatory legal mediation to sign the ultimate dissolution papers. Going no contact is not a dramatic performance. It is not a cruel punishment or a clever manipulation tactic designed to make them miss you. It is a strict, necessary medical decision for your own mental and physical survival. When you finally walk away from someone who consistently fed on your light to illuminate their own darkness, you don't owe them a lengthy explanation, and you certainly do not owe them closure. You just leave. He sat across the polished mahogany table, looking completely defeated. His designer suit was hanging loosely on a noticeably thinner frame. He slowly looked up at me, his eyes entirely devoid of their usual arrogant, mocking spark. "I just don't understand, Claire," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly in the sterile room. 7 years. You built this massive, incredible thing right next to me for 7 years. Why didn't you just tell me sooner? I looked calmly at the man I had spent a decade with. I didn't feel any anger. I didn't feel any pity. I felt nothing but cold, absolute clarity. Because, Stephen, I replied, my voice perfectly steady and quiet in the echoing room. You never actually asked me what I was doing. He stared at me, the brutal, undeniable truth of that single, devastating sentence hitting him harder than any complex legal document ever could. He finally signed the papers in total silence. So what do you think, did I go too far or not far enough? Let me know in the comments below.